Once again, good morning. For those that are watching this live stream, welcome to St. Peter the Apostle Anglican Church. We are picking up where we left off last week, discussing the beginnings of the early Middle Ages in Great Britain. And what I want to do this morning is going to briefly go over what we talked about last week, just give a quick summary, and then talk about one of the more at least for me, one of the more fascinating individuals in British history who virtually gets no mention. He's overlooked, he gets a name drop here and there. But by the time we're done today, I'm truly hoping that you see how significant he was, whether you agree with him or not, and we will have issues with him. But his imprint on Anglicanism in Great Britain in the early portions of the early Middle Ages cannot be undervalued. And his name is Theodore of Tarsus. And when I was looking at the lecture, I was trying to figure out, what's the title? Well, the reality is, with Theodore of Tarsus, we get the beginnings of diocesan organization. Not as we understand it, but Theodore was the one that brought the concept of ecclesiastical structure. Okay, one question, and then I won't be able to stop and ask. You have to wait until the end, but go ahead, JP.
Spell the last name, please.
Tarsus. It's not his name, it's the location. Saul of Tarsus, Theodore of Tarsus.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Beginnings of ecclesiastical.
Yes, this is the nascent introduction of ecclesiastical organization. Before this, it was kind of random, haphazard. We have monasteries and abbots that were not in any way what we would understand as diocesan organizations. But let me just do a quick review from last week. We finished with the North essentially being evangelized by Saint Paulinus, Paulinus, in AD 627, and he was sent there at the request or response, if you will, of St. Oswald, the king of the north, which ultimately would become Northumbria. Oswald was killed, and then we see the great missionary work of St. Aidan. And so the north and the Midlands, the mainly Anglican parts of what was to become England, are evangelized by the Scottish coming down from the north. Okay? At this point, Saxon England is largely evangelized by Roman missionaries coming out of Canterbury to the south and the east. So as we saw in the maps that I had handed out, we have this, it's this fractured nation. And it's not only fractured geographically, it's fractured liturgically. Theologically. And the inevitable collision between them takes place around beginning in 650s. And this is where the Midlands, what we identified historically as Mercia, had not effectively been evangelized. So this winds up being kind of like it's not a DMZ, but it does wind up being the area in which the battles start to play out. Okay, the king of Northumbria marries a Kentish princess, and that creates some problems. For instance, what day do we celebrate Easter? And keep that in mind, because Theodore had something to say about that. So when you have this type of turmoil and upheaval, wiser heads always want some sort of peace. They want uniformity, because everybody knows it's hard to establish governments, kingdoms, societies on rubble. It's just very difficult. So they start looking at various practices. This is what we were talking about last week. We get to the Synod of Whitby in 644, and a number of things were established at the Synod of Whitby, and not the least of which was the Roman concept of tonsure. Does anybody know what tonsuring is? It's basically, depending upon the particular representation, whether you're a Benedictine, Dominican, however, that's going to determine what the tonsuring is going to look like. Sometimes they just clip the front of the hair off. Sometimes they'll take a bit right off the skull cap, and sometimes you'll see they'll actually shave the entire top of the head, so that you've got this ring of hair, and it looks like somebody took a cereal bowl and put it on top of their head. But that's essentially what we're talking about. And it was at Whitby where the Roman, if you will, the Roman Catholic form of church government was given preference. And we've talked about that, how we have to be careful with how we identify what Rome is. At this time, it was not the organizational structure that we have today. Wasn't even the organizational structure that we had 300 years later. So it's a very loose understanding of Rome. And we talked about the British attitude towards the Romans coming in. Yes, yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Okay, get lost. We're going to do our own thing. So shortly after the Synod of Whitby, we see that the old Archbishop of Canterbury dies, and I believe I have his name here. Nope, I don't. Okay, my apologies. I had it. I erased it for this lecture. And the whole process of evangelization seems to have come to a screeching halt. Now, all of a sudden, we get this gentleman pop up, Theodore of Tarsus. Tarsus should be familiar to all of us because of St. Paul, Saul of Tarsus. And he becomes the archbishop in 669 AD. Now, at the time that he became archbishop, Theodore was 67 years old. Now, why does that matter? Because we're talking about the 7th century. He essentially is Methuselah at 67 years old in the 7th century. This is an old man, which really makes me feel old because I just turned 67. So this is really kind of depressing. So he arrives, and when he gets there, there are only 3 bishops that are operational. One was Wilfrid, who we will come to find out it was a real, how can I say this politely without getting an X-ray? He was a twit. The second was Chad, familiar to all. And the third was, and I love this guy's name, Bishop Wine. He must have been really popular because he was the Bishop of Winchester. And he was still there, but he died relatively soon in 669, 670, and then Bishop Luther, Leuthere, replaced him. Otherwise, outside of those 3, most of the seats were vacant. And the idea of the church and being organized in diocese had fallen into complete chaos. Now arrives our friend Teddy, Theodore of Tarsus. He was born in 602. He died in 690, September 19th. Now, the fact that you have a man at that time whose death, the date of his death, can be identified tells you something of his significance. We have general dates about, but we know he died on the 19th of September, 690. So he grew up in Tarsus, which is, where's Tarsus? Anybody know?
Syria?
Asia Minor, Turkey. It was Turkey. However, we have Persians roaming around, and they conquered the area. They conquered Tarsus. They conquered the surrounding regions. And Theodore escaped to Constantinople. That will become important in just a second. He began his studies in Constantinople. Subsequently, he traveled to Rome, where he was later installed as the Archbishop of Canterbury on the orders of Pope Vitalian. And he is best known for his reform of the English Church and an establishment of a school in Canterbury. Now, when you talk about Theodore, his life essentially is broken into two parts: before his consecration and after his consecration. So, look a little bit at his early life. And this is why, when I start to go through this, I hope you see why he becomes so significant and he's so fascinating. First, he was of Greek descent. He was born in Cilicia, Cilicia of Tarsus, which was a Greek-speaking diocese of the Byzantine Empire. His childhood saw the devastation of the wars between Byzantium and the Persian Sassanid Empire from King Sasan, S-A-S-A-N. And eventually, because of this Persian incursion, he was captured, because they wound up capturing Antioch, Damascus, and Jerusalem in 613 and 614. He was 11 or 12 when the Persians got him, and as a result, Theodore, a Greek speaker, now gets exposed and becomes conversant with Persian culture. So, in addition to his eventual education at Constantinople, he studied at Antioch. And for all of us who have done any work in church history or have any interest in theology, Antioch is the school of one of the most historic, distinctive schools of exegesis. And Theodore was a proponent of the Antiochian school. Now let me share with you what that meant. The Alexandrian school was the alternative at this point. So you have two different schools of how to exegete and interpret Scripture. You have the Alexandrian school, Greek, and then you have the Antiochian school, primarily Near Eastern. Now the Alexandrian school emphasized the allegorical interpretation of Scripture and tended toward a Christology. They tended toward the understanding of Christ that emphasized the union of the human and the divine. Whereas the Antiochian school held to a more, and here we go, literal and occasionally typological exegesis, and a Christology that emphasized the distinction between the human and the divine in the person of Christ. Now, if you have any sort of theological savvy, these terms now should start raising red flags in your mind, and we'll get to it in just a second. The Antiochian school rejected the notion of instantaneous creation held by St. Augustine and others. And instead, they literally held to the notion of a progressive creation of the Genesis narrative. So, those things that were existent on day 6 didn't exist on day 5. That which was in day 5 didn't exist on day 4, that which would, etc., all the way down to the beginning. Now, among the more well-known representatives of the Antiochian school included Acacius of Caesarea, Severin of Gabala, Theodore of Mopsuestia. He is really famous. I know that he wouldn't be familiar to many, but he was a contemporary of St. Jerome and St. Augustine. Theodore and many, many others. But the one that stands out, and everybody's ears should perk up at this one, was a man who, before becoming the Patriarch of Constantinople, had been a monk at Antioch, and he wound up basically absorbing all of these Antiochian principles from their school, and his name was, anybody take a guess?
Constantine.
What?
Constantine.
Not Constantine. Let me read a sentence and see if we can piece it together. The Antiochian school emphasized a distinction between the human and the divine Christ. So carry that out to its logical extension. Who would extremely represent that? Nestorius. Nestorius. Two natures, two persons. So the Nestorian heresy has its roots in the Antiochian school. Now, the Alexandrian school, on the other hand, goes the other way. And here we have the battles of Christology right here in the two schools, of which Theodore was a part of one. For the Alexandrian school, we have some very recognizable names: Athenagoras, Clement, my favorite, Didymus, and the great Origen. And where Nestorius said two people, two natures, the Alexandrian said one nature, one person. So we get the Nestorian heresy and the Monophysite, or the Eutychian, or whatever other term. It has like a dozen. But so here we have one of the original organizers of the church in Great Britain. He's not the only one, because we know Pelagius was around 200 years early. But here is somebody that brings with him a truly broad, and believe me when I tell you, it's going to get even more interesting in a sec. He brings with him a truly broad perspective into the English environment. So, not only was he educated at Constantinople, he knows the Persians. He is influenced by the Antiochians. He's also acquainted with the Syriac culture, the Syriac language and literature, and may actually have even traveled to Edessa to experience the culture firsthand. When we read the Syriac Acts of St. Milis of Persia, which was incorporated into Old English martyrology, guess who brought it to England? Our good friend Theodore. Now, at this time it was possible for Greeks to live under Persian rule. Not very comfortable, but it was possible. The Muslim conquests of Tarsus and the surrounding region in 637 would have driven Theodore from Tarsus. And he probably left somewhere around the age of 35, if not even possibly earlier, but we'll stick with 35 for right now, and that's when he left his birthplace. So what does he do? He returns to the eastern portion of the Roman Empire, and when he hits the Byzantine capital, when he hits Constantinople, he studies astronomy, ecclesiastical computus, computus. Anybody want to take a shot?
Not a chance.
The calculation of the date of Easter. This is what he starts studying. Astrology, medicine, Roman civil law, Greek rhetoric and philosophy, and not to be outdone, the use of horoscopes. So he was the first gypsy. Now, at some time in the 660s, he traveled to Rome. Now, just pause for that second right there and think about where this man had been. He's all over the place. He's being exposed to everything. This is what we would call a cosmopolitan man, well before his time. He lived in a community with Eastern monks, so now he knows what monasteries are like. And he was probably a member of the monastery of Saint Anastasius, the Greek word for resurrection or resurrect. And at this time, in addition to his already, this is why this guy fascinates me, his already profound Greek intellectual heritage, he became learned in Latin, Latin literature, and both secular and sacred Latin texts. This guy was something else. So, he dropped into the Synod of Whitby, and he's having confirmed the decision in the Anglo-Saxon Church to follow Rome in 667. At the age of 66, the See of Canterbury became vacant. Wigard, W-I-G-H-A-R-D, was the man consecrated to take the See of Canterbury. He died, just up and died. This is why I say, he's 67 years old, and he's still alive, and all of these other guys that are supposed to be in these positions, they're falling like flies. So it's really remarkable. So Wigard had been sent by Vitellian, much as Theodore was, to replace him, and this is again one of those Anglo-Saxon names, Ecgbert, E-C-G-B-E-R-H-T, the King of Kent. Okay? And endorsed by Oswy, O-S-W-Y, the King of Northumbria, for consecration as Archbishop, he now is going to take the see meant for Wigard. This cosmopolitan, intelligent, just brilliant man winds up as the first, well, not the first, but he winds up as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, following Wigard's death, Theodore, chosen by Vitellian upon the recommendation of Hadrian, not the Roman emperor, Hadrian, who was the abbot of St. Peter's, Canterbury, Theodore is consecrated in Rome, 26 March, 668. And with Hadrian, he arrives in Great Britain a year later, 27 May, 669. Now, he arrives as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now remember, Canterbury, we're talking about southeast. We're in Kent. We're in the lower left section. We're looking at a map. So he conducts a survey of the English church. And he appointed various bishops, if I can speak English, it'd be good, various bishops to the sees that were vacant. Now, I mentioned last week how many sees were vacant. Anybody remember the number? Offhand?
21.
21 sees were vacant. 21. And he came in and, like any good administrator, got somebody in every single one of them. The guy was an organizational master. Then he called the Synod of Hertford, H-E-R-T-F-O-R-D. You talk about hit the ground running, this guy hit the ground running. His desire at the Synod of Hertford was to institute reforms concerning nothing less than the proper calculation of Easter. He also instituted reforms concerning episcopal authority, about the responsibility of itinerant monks, the regular convening of synods, marriage and the prohibitions of consanguinity, in other words, shacking up, and many, 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 many other reforms. But in just those little things, you can see the idea starting to gel of how a diocese is to be, or just the idea that he wanted regular synods in and of themselves establishes the foundation of the principle, the organizational principle of a diocese. He also proposed subdividing the large diocese of Northumbria, and this brought him into a head-on clash with our friend Wilfrid. And Wilfrid was the Bishop of York, and they battled it out for over a decade. Theodore's reforms were so thorough that they carried the church, note this, he was so adept at being an administrator and an organizer, and instituting the reforms that he did, that they lasted for over a century and a half without change. A century and a half. And the conflict that he had with Wilfrid was only settled in 686, 687, 10, 11 years later. And I'm going to have to stop with the next paragraph, and I'll get to the rest of Theodore next week, unfortunately, because there's just so much to talk about with him. In 679, about a decade before Theodore dies, Alfwine, Aelfwine, the brother of the other weird spelling name, Ecgfrith, E-C, yeah, I'm telling you, these guys just drive me crazy, E-C-G-F-R-I-T-H of Northumbria, the brother Alfwine dies. He dies in the battle against fighting the Mercians. Now remember, notice, we're still talking about multiple kingdoms existing. Mercian, Northumbria, Kent, they're still here. So you have to keep that in mind when you talk about even the great reforms of Theodore and what he had done in England. There's still these intramural, internecine, regional kingdom battles. It was, now wait, not only is he a great administrator and an organizer and genius, and he knows all these cultures, he stepped in to stop the war. If they had capes, he would have worn a cape with a red S on his chest. The guy's just something else. He prevented the escalation of the war, and it resulted in a peace agreement between the two kingdoms, with King Ethelred of Mercia paying weregild compensation for Alfwin's death. And it only begins to fall apart in 793, when the Norsemen hit in the Battle of Lindisfarne. Now, in case you're wondering, weregild, W-E-R-E-G-I-L-D, weregild compensation is basically monies paid for wrongful death. That's the simplest way to, it goes on today in Turkey. And it goes on in the most bizarre manner. For instance, and don't ask me how I know this, but if you're in Turkey and you accidentally kill a man's cow, a female cow, determining, all right, bull, but a female cow. I'm trying to save time here. If you kill this man's cow, depending upon the age and the health of the cow, you have to pay for the death of the cow, the death of the offspring that cow would have, the death of the offspring of that cow. This was what what did I say his name was? This is what Ethelred had to pay. Now it wasn't as extreme within Great Britain, but that's the principle. Okay? All right, I have to stop because I've got 2 more pages of notes and I'm not going to get to them, and I want to make sure we get to morning prayer. So, any questions about my favorite dude of the 7th century? I just love this guy. I don't necessarily agree with his position. I don't support the Antiochian school. But one of the things, and Father Michael confirmed this, one of the things that we learned in church history is that the originator of something, generally speaking, is always a brilliant innovator and castigated for the mistakes that he makes. Because he's the first. He's paving the way. He is a chart. He sets the course. And of course he's going to screw up. I know guys that will argue today that Nestorius did not really believe what his followers claim. Same thing with Zwingli. There are people that will argue. Read Stephen. I can't remember his name. Gosh, I'm getting old. Anyway, wrote a great book on Zwingli and makes a very strong case that Zwingli didn't believe Zwinglianism. That it was his followers that abused what Zwingli was saying. So anyway, this guy he really fascinates me. And he stands in such a primary position in the history of Great Britain because of what he was able to bring, whether we agree with him or not. Because realize, even if we as Anglicans don't acknowledge and recognize, which we shouldn't, the overbearing and overarching Roman theological influence, there's no doubt we understood episcopacy based on how it was formulated by Theodore, and obviously others before him, but he was the one that, through sheer effort of will and genius, lays the foundation for what would ultimately become parishes and dioceses. Not fully formed or developed at this time. This is church history. Everything takes time. It's got to develop. But this man was the tip of the spear. Okay, so 10 minutes. Anything strike you? Anything you want to talk about?
What about his formulation of the day of Easter? Is it like what we use?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's the one that, at least for Great Britain, establishes the Western date.
And our formulation for the date of Easter is based on the lunar cycle. Is that correct?
Yeah. The irony is, and all you ladies here you're gonna love this. The date of Easter was actually calculated about 300 years earlier by St. Augustine's, Constantine. Constantine's mother. She traveled she traveled from Constantinople. I want to know, and she went all the way back, and she was the one that came up with one of the original computations and dates for the Western date for Easter, so yes, it's your fault. Wow, you should see the look I got in this side of the room. No, but you guys are 300, I mean, she was 300 years ahead of Theodore. And generally really doesn't get the credit for it. And she probably should get the credit for it because, he may have taken a more quote unquote technical or Latin influenced procedure to determine the date, but they essentially arrived at the same date. And she was well ahead of the curve. Monaco. No, that was Augustine's mom's. Yeah.
Helena?
Helena, thank you. That was Augustine. Constantine. Helena, that's right. No, nothing. You guys are not fascinated by this guy? This is amazing. Wait till we get to next week and we start talking about the Canterbury School and all this other thing. He taught sacred music. I mean, this guy did everything. Yes, ma'am.
So, did he leave writings, or we just?
Yep.
So he wrote.
Yep. Matter of fact, that's next week.
That's fine.
Next week. I actually have it. He wrote something called the Laterculus Malleanus. Write it down. You asked. No. I'm teasing. I'm teasing. See, you ask a question. Basically what it was. And I don't want to get too far because I don't want to steal my material. But all that is latter the lateral. How did I can't pronounce it? The laterculus is, think of a ladder. LADD. It's spelled LAT, but think of a ladder, and when you look at a ladder, you're looking at rungs. It's basically it's a chronology. That's what we're talking about. And man, this guy's name.
That's a good one.
Mallianus. That's Malalianus. Mallianus. The Laterculus motto. Anyway, that guy is based on the chronology of the life of Christ from a man named Malanus, Malanus. That's much easier than the plural form. So Theodore took that and presented that and translated that for us. That work was lost until 1990.
Oh, my goodness.
Wow.
And it was lost until see, I'm stealing all
Yeah,
my
where was it
stuff
found?
from next week. But anyway,
Where was it found?
huh?
Where was it found?
It was found in Turkey. Asia Minor.
So they dug it up.
And one of the glossaries, gosh, I'm talking about everything from next week. Close my notes. One of the glossaries from Theodore is held in Leiden. The Leiden Library has it. I'm telling you, this guy's something else. If you have any interest in history and you want to do some really serious scholarly work, this would be a guy that could really get your juices flowing because he does everything. He knows everything. I mean, he's something else. And he did it at like 60. I mean, look at how old he was. It gives me hope. So, anyway,
Should be encouraging, not depressing.
that's why I said gives me hope.
Yeah.
Anything else? Anybody? Oh, I'm so excited.
But wait, you said that,
Yes.
so you were talking about his brilliance,
Mhm.
but then you said that the first of anything pays for their mistakes, just like their brilliance. So are we going to see, like you said, did you use the word castigated? What did he say?
Yeah, they usually
how
are, Nestorius, I mean, yeah, they usually get castigated. Origin,
So-
same thing with Origin.
So how is he? How has he been? Or is that next week too? Never mind. Somebody else asked a question. I have questions, but they're forward.
They're good question. No. The problem is we're kind of constrained with time. If this was a normal lecture, I'd have another 20 minutes. No.
None of your lectures are normal
No,
lectures.
thank you very much. Okay, and I'll have to delete that from the tape. But yeah, and there's really I only have like two and a half pages, which would take another 20 minutes. But he's remarkable. He's so remarkable. And as I said, I don't agree with him on a lot of things. I don't agree with the Antiochian school. Yes.
When you said that Antiochian school had a more typical or typological
Yeah.
or literal
Yeah.
exegesis,
Yeah.
and how do you mean literal here?
I mean literal in the way that we would understand the common sense understanding of language, and then a little bit more. Let me give you an illustration. The Alexandrian school, being an allegorical school of interpretation, would look at, let's say we're talking about a table that a church father may have used, okay? And that table was used to discuss theology. So what they would say is, well, the table represents the Bible, and each of the four legs represents one of the Gospels. There's the allegorical interpretation. Whereas the literal interpretation would say, it's a table. Okay? That's all it is, it's a table. But that's what they would say. That's all it is,
Right.
is a table.
Yeah.
There's no typological representation going on. It isn't like we will see this morning in the gospel, where we have a significant typological picture being presented that is sacramental. If you read this morning's gospel, you know what I'm talking about. So that creates a significant locking of horns when you know the Bible and four Gospels and and whatever's on the table becomes whatever. Well, he had a steak which was a lamb, which meant sacrifice. Yeah, I mean we can go nuts with all of this stuff. But that's what the Antiochian school was. To what they were reacting.
Okay.
All right.
Well, so then allegorical versus typological. What's the?
Well, typological means that for us, what it means is that whatever the image presented here, it points forward to a fulfillment of something greater. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Whereas allegorical usually winds up being fanciful.
Okay.
Four legs on the table. That's not. I mean, that's a stretch to say it's the gospel. So there's the difference. The
Right.
problem is when you start getting into maintaining that rigid literalness. Ask Peter Lombard,
And it's I mean,
who emasculated
genre. Well, yeah.
So
Or in origin. Yeah.
Or origins. Yeah, even origins.
Yeah. And you run into difficulty when it's context dependent genre.
Yep.
Like what?
That's-
how do you literally interpret a poem?
And the fathers were not they were not oblivious to literary genre. Believe me, they were well ahead of what we want to give them credit. They understood literary genre, poetry. I mean, good grief! Look at some of the poets we had. Ovid, and I mean, unbelievable.
Yeah.
But they would have a tendency. The West would have a tendency of, being a little like I got a corn cob stuck somewhere, and it's just like this is what it is. It's like okay. So it took some time to kind of merge, flesh out, and then develop a fuller understanding, where some of the thought from the East was brought in, especially the concept of union, but not to the extreme, and then some of the concepts of the typology and literal understanding of the West was brought in, but not such that it created a straitjacket for us. You know, like Jesus is the door. Well, where's the doorknob in his belly button? I don't see it, you know. Does his elbows have hinges? I mean, you know, it's stupid stuff like that. So, anyway, I hate to do it, gotta stop. I could talk about this guy forever, but we have morning prayer.